The United States is struggling to find a consistent justification for seizing an oil vessel off the coast of Venezuela. On Thursday, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt suggested they were just trying to enforce sanctions.
Department of Justice requested and was approved for a warrant to seize a vessel because it's a sanctioned shadow vessel known for carrying black market sanctioned oil to the IRGC, which you know is a sanctioned entity. So the president is committed to stopping the illegal flow of drugs into our country. He's also fully committed to effectuating this administration's sanction policy, and that's what you saw and the world saw take place yesterday.
So she's saying it's about sanctions. This was a sanctioned ship. And it was taking oil to a sanctioned country, Iran in this case. So therefore, this was just Donald Trump, who's obviously, a stickler for the rules, enforcing the laws of the United States. Soon after, though, Donald Trump said the action against Venezuela was for a different reason. So he said it was to stem the flow of immigrants and drugs.
So it has to do with a lot of things. They've treated us badly, and I guess now we're not treating them so good. If you look at the drug traffic by sea is down 92%. And nobody can figure out who the 8% is because I have no idea. Anybody getting involved in that right now is not doing well. And we'll start that on land, too.
The idea that seizing an oil tanker can be seen as a legitimate part of a war on drugs is obviously completely nonsense. The US has suggested it will take the oil from the tanker for itself, so not exactly subtle. And sources suggest it plans to seize more such tankers. It might also just be a conveyance of brute strength, though, which is what most attracts Trump. So these images you're seeing now, they were released by the White House on Thursday. Trump has, of course, previously shared footage of US military aircraft striking speedboats traveling from Venezuela to the US, allegedly ferrying narcotics. Again, this is completely extrajudicial. So how should we make sense of the shifting US justifications for their latest attack on Venezuelan interests? I spoke earlier to writer and analyst Juan David Rojas.
So the administration and supporters of the administration, from what I've seen, they've really given just kind of an all of the above rationale for doing this. Before seizing this tanker, which is pretty significant, it's the largest ever seized. And it's the first Venezuelan one, I believe, that has been seized. The strikes they were talking about, it's because of the drugs. Even that rationale is extremely dubious. They presented no evidence. It's likely that some of the boats, maybe even a majority of the boats, were carrying drugs, but it's quite possible that many of them were not. And, Venezuela in the grand scheme of things is not a huge producer of drugs. It is a transit country for like Colombian cocaine, but even then, like the total amount of cocaine that passes through Venezuela, it's thought to be at most like 10%. So that rationale is dubious. Obviously, this tanker didn't have any drugs that we know of, and otherwise we probably would have heard about it. They've said that this is in order to get Venezuela to comply with sanctions. This tanker, it was actually going to Cuba. Historically, Venezuela has sent billions of dollars since 1999 worth of oil to Cuba. Cuba's extremely reliant on Venezuelan oil for its power plants, and also resells that oil on the global market, marks it up, and has historically made a significant profit. Obviously, receives less than during the boom years of like the 2000s under Chavez. But so, yeah, you can really see this as part of the maximum pressure campaign. Some influencers in MAGA, and I think even elected officials have said that it's just, we do this just because we can. And that's kind of been the MO of a lot of Trumpism, that it's just like, we're powerful, we can do what we want if you're a state that, can't really do anything about it. I believe, it was like Kevin Hassett yesterday that said or no, someone on CNN that said, we did this, and what are the Venezuelans going to do about it? Nothing. So it's really all of the above. I definitely see a connection here to and that's really the through line for everything that's going on with Venezuela, just the kind of neoconservative foreign policy. I'm in Fort Lauderdale near Miami. The Cuban American community which the Secretary of State Marco Rubio was the Florida senator. He's was a former Florida senator and a Miami native. Uh, this is something that many Cuban Americans down here have called for a long time. They hate the fact that Venezuela has been propping up Cuba for a long time, which in their opinion is kind of the head of the snake of regional leftist governments, especially within the Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela.
The Trump administration, as you say, using the kind of all of the above strategy when it comes to why are we doing this. Can we discern what is the real plan? What is the real strategy? Because I suppose if what you're trying to do is keep anti-communists in Florida happy, then ideally what they're going to want is regime change. But I suppose also just being seen to be bullying Maduro or the Cubans might get you some brownie points. I mean, which of those do you think it is?
Yeah, so in the way a lot of this administration works with regards to all of its constituencies, including like extremely conservative, neoconservative Cuban Americans, is just signaling. So it's just we need to show our base that we're doing something, and the strikes are interesting. It's pretty genius in a way because it manages to satisfy both a lot of like the MAGA base and like the rural heartland that is like upset over overdoses, mostly fentanyl overdoses, which is why this is insane because Venezuela produces no fentanyl, zero, according to the DEA, and is only responsible for the trafficking of a small amount of cocaine. But anyway, uh, a lot of supporters, like rank and file supporters of the administration, will say, "Yeah, this is revenge for fentanyl and blah 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 blah. We're sticking it to traffickers. The war on drugs hasn't worked, so now we're going a step further. We're just blowing these guys up in the ocean." And that also obviously pleases a lot of neoconservative Latinos down here that just want to stick it to tyrannical leftist governments like the one in Cuba or in Venezuela. It's it's as far as what exactly they want to do, it's really hard to tell. Uh, I would say Trump does seem to have an aversion to putting boots on the ground, and that is reportedly something that they are afraid of. And we look at the MO of what happened in Iran earlier this year. Like they did those strikes, and the justification of the nuclear weapons and whatever, which also is very dubious. But to be fair, yeah, they dropped the bombs, and then that was it. They wrapped up the 12-day war and called it a day, and we haven't heard about it since for now. So in this case, most likely what they would try to do is just do some strikes on like critical infrastructure in Venezuela. The problem though is a fear, and apparently they do have this fear in the administration as well, that just that would lead to like regime collapse, which is what they want, but they're also scared of like creating like a Libya-esque scenario. That's something that's been really talked about, especially from opponents on the right on this issue. So I've made that case as well. So it's one thing that what they really ideally would want, evidently, is just Maduro to step down on his own and just hand over power to the opposition, which he's more or less offered to do according to various reports. But I guess I don't know. They're trying to find the perfect sweet spot, which likely doesn't exist. I don't know. It's hard to exactly tell.
I wasn't aware of that. Maduro has, you say, he's shown willingness to just hand over power to the opposition. What's the story there? That seems like a big deal.
Well, if if I was more sympathetic to what the administration was doing, I would say that Maduro can't be trusted. Whatever he says, it's a lie. And to be fair, yeah, there is some truth to that. He's an extremely cunning. He seems really dumb, but he's an extremely cunning political operator, or at least the totality of his regime is, and the people advising him. That said, there is pretty credible reporting that has said that he's offered to like step down in 2030, which is like when the next elections would be. The New York Times reported that he offered Trump to redirect all oil sales from China to the U.S. and also allow American companies to like take control over Venezuela's like gold and mineral exports and slash contracts with Iran and Russia as well. So I mean, he just wants his regime to survive, and also if he has to step down, which sure, 2030 is a ways away. But if he were to step down, that he can have like a graceful exit and live out the rest of his days in peace, presumably in Cuba or Russia, who knows? But again, that's probably just not good enough for Rubio. Most likely, him and the other Rubio has staffed a lot of the administration with um, allies from Miami. A lot of the ambassadors in Latin America are from Miami and allies of Rubio, also in the State Department. And a lot of obviously, a lot of Trump's administration in general are Floridians. They might not be of the uber neoconservative kind with regards to Latin America, but they're definitely intimately familiar with a lot of these narratives about narco terrorism in Venezuela and blah, 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 blah. So I would say, yeah, that Rubio most likely and his allies, they just want Maduro out tomorrow. That's their goal. And if they can't get that, I guess that's not good enough.
You've written an article saying regime change in Venezuela would be bad for America. I mean, most of our audience is sort of going to naturally agree with you on that. I did want to ask, though, because when I think about regime change by the Americans, sort of my mind is so full of governments being toppled in West Asia and the Middle East, North Africa, so Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the story involves, I suppose, political Islam on one level, terrorism on one level, sort of all these stories we have about why it was so mistaken for the West to go into the Middle East. I suppose, obviously, there are lots of examples in recent history of regime change in Latin America by the United States or supported by the United States. Those are, I suppose, further from memory at the moment. And so people say, well, it's not going to look like Libya because it's a very different place. What does regime change in Latin America look like? What would we expect regime change in Venezuela to look like?
That's an excellent question. What you just said just reminded me, we forgot an important justification that they're giving for this stuff. Rubio gave an interview recently, and the Wall Street Journal has also made arguments like this, that Venezuela is a foothold for Hezbollah and Iran. And that's why we need to topple Maduro. So, the Wall Street Journal actually ran this insane article saying that Venezuelan cocaine is funding jihadists in West Africa. So, anyway, but going back to your broader question, yeah, obviously the U.S. has a long history of regime change in the Americas. As you mentioned, in recent decades, less so. The Cold War was really the period where they were just cooing right and left in Chile and Guatemala, et cetera. If not like directly organizing coups, at least facilitating them or greenlighting them. In recent decades, there have been some that, if not entirely supported by the U.S. Or organized by the U.S., yeah, were backed by a particular administration. So, and actually, Honduras just had an election that's still contested, and Trump got involved in that. But the Obama administration actually was really key in supporting the 2009 coup that led sort of to the current government, the husband of the current president being ousted. Anyway, that's another story. And actually, in Venezuela in 2002, Chavez was removed from office for a few days and managed to come back just because of popular support. And actually, Maria Corina Machado was highly involved in that. And that was very much supported by the United States. So, but for the last part of your question, as to what regime change now in Venezuela would look like, supporters talk all the time about Panama. It's like, oh, look at Panama. Yeah, this won't be like Libya. And that's what a lot of them say. No, don't worry about this. this won't be like Libya. And they probably say that because people in the administration are worried about that. The thing about Panama, number one, is that it's a way smaller country with that has like a huge U.S. U.S. Presence, and at the time, the canal was still controlled by the United States in its entirety. Had I think already like 10,000 troops. So in total, I think that it was like 20,000 troops that were used during that operation that got Noriega. Um, but even in Panama, it's true as far as regime change goes. I like to say that technically, it's possible for regime change not to be a disaster. And really, the cases you think about are Panama and Grenada. But those are those are really the exceptions that prove the rule. Because for every Panama, yeah, as you mentioned, there's an Iraq, a Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But even in Panama, it actually took several weeks before Noriega loyalists were finally put down. So the problem in Venezuela is way worse because number one, it's a way larger country. Its military is kind of a joke. I think that if the U.S. were to start dropping bombs, and especially invade, most of the Venezuelan military would give up. A lot of their uh, equipment is extremely outdated. But more troublingly, the country has been verging on failed state status for a long, long time. If you just remove Maduro by force, I can see a situation where it turns into, something like Libya, that just different generals carve out the country. There's a ton of different armed groups, Colombian guerrillas, the ELN, the FARC. Really, something that should be talked more about is what a like Colombian scenario, like from the 1990s and 80s, would look at early 2000s would look like in Venezuela following regime change. Like these like guerrillas are historically, uh, you know, the ELN has been around for like 60 years since like the early 60s, and is extremely proficient in like high profile kidnappings, uh, terrorist attacks, like with car bombs, plane jackings, all of this kind of stuff. There are skirmishes between guerrillas and the Venezuelan government. But conceivably, if the U.S. Overthrows Maduro and installs the opposition by force, there will be a significant insurgency from these groups and others, the like paramilitary colectivos that support Chavismo, that will rise up most likely and uh, wage some sort of insurgency. So I see a lot of dangers here for some sort of protracted conflict that will lead to more immigration from Venezuela. I don't think it's a good idea.
The Panama coup was in 1989, the
Yeah.
Grenada coup in 1983.
hmm
Finally, I'm going to ask you I say finally, but it's going to be a huge question, so apologies. But you've alluded there to the emigration crisis in Venezuela, that it's close to a failed state. How should we understand how Venezuela got to that position? Obviously, there's one argument that this was the inevitable result of having this giant superpower quite close that wants to bring down any kind of socialist project at all costs, and that has sort of put Venezuela's back against the wall and made all this inevitable. Other people argue that there was sort of certain elements of the regime which was subject to internal contradictions. If you were to sort of summarize what went wrong in Venezuela, because it has gone horribly wrong, what would you point to?
I'm going to try to be as fair as possible. And I do have my biases and spend a lot of time arguing with people that call themselves anti-imperialists about this topic. Because, if you're a neocon, you just say, oh, it's socialism. Socialism ruined Venezuela. And I think there's some truth to that. There was mismanagement and like, anyway. Uh, on the other hand, if you're like a diehard anti-imperialist, And to be clear, I think that any form of imperialism is bad for any country. But most of the people that call themselves that just say, oh, it's US sanctions. Poor Venezuela. It was a socialist paradise. Chavez was this anti-imperialist hero, and then the US got involved, and poor Venezuela. And now all the sanctions have pushed everyone from the country. The truth is that both of these narratives have some degree of merit to them. So, for example, frankly, Chavez did become much more radicalized after the 2002 coup. He purged all the military, and that's when he really started consolidating power. Um, that said, from the beginning, and the 2000 coup did put this into overdrive. He did always show intentions of like trying to stay in office forever, and that's extremely disturbing. You know, he rewrote the Constitution, first to extend his term to 6 years, which already is insane, and with the option for reelection, then got rid of term limits. And so it's like now you have this situation where, okay, whoever is the Chavista president it governs for 6 years with an unlimited potential for reelection that they just rig. In like 2015, the opposition actually won the legislative elections, took control of the unicameral legislature, the National Assembly. And Chavismo, what they did is that right before they took the new legislature was about to take power, they just uh, removed all of the justices on the Supreme Court, put in cronies, and then that Supreme Court, once the opposition legislature took over, it stripped them of their powers. They just became decorative. And yeah, Maduro has been ruling by decree for a long time. You could say that Trump has kind of been ruling by decree a lot here too. But all of this is to say that yeah, there is shared responsibilities on both sides. Oh, the economic part. Uh, Oil production in Venezuela has collapsed. It's not entirely due to sanctions, though. Before the U.S. really started imposing sanctions, which the first ones against PDVSA, the first significant ones against PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company, came in 2017, and then there was a full embargo with some carve-outs in 2019. Before 2017, though, since the 2000s, oil production had been gradually falling. It hadn't been that much, but it was falling. In 2014, there was the commodities bust, especially in oil. The price in oil collapsed, and this is actually what started Venezuela's crisis. So 2014, 2015, especially 2016, you already had hyperinflation. By 2016, I think already like 1 million Venezuelans had left the country, all before the U.S. imposed sanctions. So that suggests that, to me, that sanctions didn't, completely. It wasn't like the genesis of the problem. The problem is the fact that Venezuela their economy has no sort of diversification. It's like 90% oil. So even if the opposition had been in charge, you could say maybe in 2014 the crisis wouldn't have been as bad, but the economy would have collapsed one way or another. It's only a question of extent. Now, after 2017, I think you can definitely make an argument that the sanctions made the crisis even worse. And I think you can blame the U.S. in part for like fomenting even further waves. Today it's something like 8 million people have left Venezuela for the United States. So all of this is to say, yeah, there was a lot of co-responsibilities, a lot of dishonest morons, frankly, that are just keen on perpetuating narratives and looking at all of this stuff simplistically based on their ideological preferences. It's more complicated than that.
The problem that sort of what everyone seems to agree on about Venezuela is that they didn't move away from dependency on oil. So the Chavez
Absolutely.
model was to export oil and then sort of in what made him different from those who came before is that he distributed the oil rents to the people. Very good. But then the critique that everyone agrees on is that he didn't move the economy towards different sectors. Why didn't that happen? Because presumably it's not just that Chavez was stupid and thought, oh, the oil price will always be high. Like, was there an attempt to move towards other export sectors? And if not, why? And if so, what stopped that happening? Why did it not become a diverse economy?
Unfortunately, my answer is going to be very disappointing. He really was that stupid. Now, in his defense, you can say that about most Latin American leaders. And on the other hand, it is actually pretty difficult to diversify a lot of these economies, and it takes a really, really long time. Now, in the case of Venezuela, the truth is he really did think that oil prices would stay high for forever. I mean, on the one hand, the reason why prices skyrocketed was in the 2000s was because of the U.S.'s interventions in the Middle East and Iraq, etc. And really, what no one saw coming is that the U.S. would end up becoming what caused the commodities collapse in 2014 was the fact that the U.S. became this insane oil producer because of the shale boom with fracking. So just overnight in the start of the 2010s, the U.S. started to produce just absurd amounts of oil, and that's what ended up causing the price to collapse. And Chavez, unfortunately, that's another thing. I like to say this a lot. If you look at Bolivia, for example, which that's another sad story. They also kind of ran things and drove into the ground, but not as bad as at the end, but not as bad as Venezuela. And the thing about in Bolivia, the MAS, the movement towards socialism, which was allied with Chavismo and Maduro, they during the commodities boom, they exported a lot of natural gas. And what they did is that they actually saved the rents that was extracted from the sale of their commodities. Really smart. They amassed huge amounts of foreign reserves, and then once the 2014 came around and production started to fall, they were able to use those foreign reserves to maintain a certain standard of living. Unfortunately, over time, they depleted it all, but still, that was smart. That was long term strategic thinking. Chavez did not do anything of the sort. He completely splurged all of the oil rents that he got during the 2000s. And where'd it go? It went to Cuba, it went to the rest of the Caribbean, it went to African countries. And you can say like that this is that was extremely benign of him. On the other hand, it was a way of him to exert influence. But it was not responsible macroeconomically. And so once the other thing is that unfortunately the regime failed to maintain the country's oil refineries. And so over time they began to decay. They're extremely decayed now. And that's what led to that gradual fall in oil production, even before 2014 that I mentioned. So it's, yeah, it's sad.